The map of this story is drawn in oil, and if you're not paying close attention right now, you're going to miss one of the most consequential geopolitical shifts of our lifetime. What's happening in the Persian Gulf today is not a regional skirmish, not a diplomatic misunderstanding, and certainly not the kind of story your mainstream television anchor is going to sit down and explain honestly. This is about who controls the energy arteries of the modern world, who gets to decide which economies breathe and which ones choke, and how a body of water barely 21 miles wide at its narrowest point has become the fulcrum on which the entire balance of global power is now tipping. Iran has effectively revealed something that powerful men in Washington, Riyadh, and Beijing have long known but never wanted spoken plainly, that the Gulf's oil fields, those vast underground reserves that have financed wars, bought political alliances, and kept the dollar as the world's reserve currency, cannot move without Tehran's permission. And Donald Trump, true to form, went straight to Truth Social and pointed his finger directly at Xi Jinping. Xi, for his part, said nothing. And that silence, that carefully calculated, strategically deliberate silence from Beijing, may be the most important signal in this entire story. Now let's walk through all of this carefully, because the details matter enormously here, and I want you to understand not just what happened, but why it happened and what it means for you sitting in America right now. The closure of the Strait of Hormuz following the outbreak of military conflict with Iran on February 28, 2026 is, at its core, a geopolitically driven oil supply disruption unlike anything the modern world has seen before. But to understand why February 28th happened at all, you need to go back much further than that date. You need to understand a relationship that was quietly constructed over years between Washington and Beijing. A silent, existential competition over the physical architecture of global energy. Because what we are watching right now is not really a war between the United States and Iran. It is a proxy confrontation between America and China, being fought with missiles and naval blockades, but whose real currency is oil, access, and economic survival. By 2025, US sanctioned crude from Iran and Venezuela accounted for roughly 17 to 18% of China's total oil imports. Think about that for a moment. Nearly 1 in 5 barrels of oil that kept Chinese factories running, Chinese cities lit, and the Chinese military fueled was coming from countries that Washington had declared off-limits. China's state-owned giant refineries kept their hands officially clean. They used smaller, nominally private refiners, what the industry calls teapots, to handle the dirty work. Beijing supplied the port access and the studied indifference that made the whole system possible. It was a beautiful, cynical arrangement, and Washington let it go on for a while because disrupting it risked spiking oil prices and triggering a global recession. But Trump, when he came back into office, decided the time for tolerance was over. He began targeting the supply end of the chain, and that decision set in motion everything we are now watching unfold. In early March 2026, Iran effectively closed the Strait of Hormuz in response to the war launched by the United States and Israel, making it impossible for oil and gas to be exported from the Gulf without its agreement. The International Energy Agency described this as the biggest market disruption in the history of the oil industry. Let that sink in. Not the 1973 Arab oil embargo, not the Gulf War, not the Iranian Revolution. This, right now, is the largest single disruption to global oil supply in recorded history. Following the closure of the strait, Brent crude surged past $120 per barrel. Qatar Energy declared force majeure on all exports, and the oil production of Kuwait, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates collectively dropped by at least 10 million barrels per day. 10 million barrels a day, gone, just like that. And the world's energy markets, which had been humming along, suddenly looked like a cardiac patient who'd just been told the bypass surgery was cancelled. It is striking that amid the crisis, while Iran's economy is being badly damaged by the war, Iran is still exporting oil to China using the Strait of Hormuz, even as it closes the passage to Gulf countries' shipping. Read that again slowly. Iran is at war, Iran's cities have been struck, its nuclear facilities targeted, its economy hammered, and yet oil tankers bound for Chinese ports are still moving through the strait, while every other country's shipments are strangled. What does that tell you? It tells you that the Strait of Hormuz closure is not simply an act of desperation by a cornered nation. It is a highly strategic, surgical tool. Iran is not closing the strait for everyone. It is closing it selectively, shutting the valve for America's Gulf allies while keeping it cracked open just enough for Beijing. That is not the behavior of a country acting out of panic. That is the behavior of a country executing a plan. And so now you begin to see the full picture. Iran holds the key to the Gulf's oil fields, not by owning them, but by controlling the only viable exit route for their output. Iran has been assessed to have the capacity, via the threatened or actual use of mines, speedboats, submarines, shore-based cruise missiles, aircraft, and other systems, to disrupt the flow of commercial shipping into and out of the Persian Gulf. For decades, analysts said, yes, Iran has this capability, but surely they would never actually use it because the economic consequences for Iran itself would be too severe. Well, they used it, and the consequences for everyone, including Iran, have been severe. But Tehran made a calculation that the leverage it gains from this move outweighs the pain it absorbs, because the pain is temporary, the leverage is structural. On March 1st, 2026, Iran began to strike civilian shipping in and around the Strait of Hormuz. As of late March, Iran had hit more than 20 ships. Daily transits through the strait dropped from an average of 135 to just 10. Private insurance costs for a single Hormuz transit rose from around 0.25% of vessel value to 5% or more. Shipping companies, tanker operators, commodity traders, they all did the math very quickly and decided the risk was not worth it. The strait, for all practical purposes, became a no-go zone for anyone who wasn't sailing under the protection of a very specific arrangement with Tehran. Now here is where Trump enters the picture. Loudly, characteristically, and with his finger pointed squarely at Beijing. Trump said the US had intercepted a ship carrying a gift to Iran from China as Tehran tried to restock its military during the ceasefire. I was a little surprised, he added, saying he thought he had an understanding with China's President Xi Jinping. That phrase, "I thought I had an understanding," is one of the most revealing things Trump has said in this entire crisis. It tells you that there were back-channel conversations between Washington and Beijing, that Xi had apparently given Trump some signal, some assurance, that China would not actively help Iran rearm during the ceasefire window. And then a Chinese ship showed up loaded with what the US Navy described as military resupply material. Trump was not just angry, he was genuinely caught off guard. And that embarrassment, that feeling of having been played, is exactly what drove his subsequent social media posts, where he began publicly naming China as a factor in the crisis. China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs responded that the US naval blockade of the Strait of Hormuz risked undermining an already fragile ceasefire situation. Notice the framing. Beijing did not say the blockade was illegal, though they likely believe it is. Beijing did not say the US was behaving recklessly, though they certainly think that too. They used the language of concern, delicate, diplomatic, non-committal, and they placed the responsibility for instability on Washington's actions rather than Tehran's. This is classic Chinese diplomatic communication. Say enough to signal displeasure, say nothing specific enough to be held to account. China, the world's largest importer of energy, has so far weathered the global energy shock brought on by war in the Gulf well compared with some of its Asian neighbors. As the main importer of Iranian oil, China is the country that stands to be most impacted by US moves impacting its flow, both when the White House removed certain US sanctions on Iranian barrels and now as the US military launches a blockade of Iranian ports. China had been preparing for an energy shock for years. Strategic petroleum reserves, long-term supply contracts diversified across multiple continents, quiet bilateral arrangements with producers in Africa, Central Asia, and Russia. When the Hormuz crisis hit, Beijing had buffers that most other countries simply did not have. But buffers are not permanent solutions. They buy time, and that time is running out. By late March 2026, United Arab Emirates diplomatic advisor Anwar Gargash confirmed what some analysts had anticipated. Iran's missile and drone strikes on Gulf states had cemented Tehran as the primary regional threat, forcing Arab nations to rethink their alignments. This is a massive shift. For years, the Gulf Arab states had been pursuing a quiet rapprochement with Iran, hedging their bets between Washington and Beijing, trying to avoid being locked into an alliance structure that might drag them into a conflict they did not want. That calculation is now being revised. When Iranian missiles start landing in Dubai and Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, the abstract geopolitical balancing act becomes very concrete very fast. And Trump saw his moment. Sensing the shift, Trump called on Saudi Arabia in late March to join the Abraham Accords. But whereas the Israeli Prime Minister was eyeing pipeline routes to redirect Gulf oil away from Chinese buyers toward European markets, Trump wanted to capture the oil fields themselves. The model he had in mind was already operating in Venezuela, where the US had engineered a compliant interlocutor after seizing Nicolas Maduro. This is not a minor diplomatic footnote. This is the entire strategic logic of the current moment laid bare. The goal is not merely to neutralize Iran's nuclear program or to protect Israeli security, though those objectives serve as useful public justifications. The deeper goal, the one that almost nobody in mainstream media is willing to name directly, is to restructure the flow of Gulf oil so that it serves American strategic interests and disadvantages China. Think about what a functional Abraham Accords that includes Saudi Arabia would actually mean in energy terms. It would mean Gulf oil flowing through pipelines that bypass the Strait of Hormuz entirely, traveling overland to Mediterranean ports and from there to European markets. Oil traveling overland to Israeli ports and onward to European markets would cost more for Asian buyers and less for European ones, effectively redirecting energy flows away from China and toward America's allies. That single infrastructure shift would represent the most significant reorientation of global energy geopolitics since the original oil for security deal that Washington and Riyadh struck in 1945. It would mean that China, which today depends on Gulf oil for a third of its total energy imports, would suddenly find itself paying a premium for supply that used to be cheap and convenient, and that premium would cascade through the entire Chinese economy. This is why Xi's silence is so loud. Beijing understands exactly what is being proposed here, and it understands that a public confrontation with Washington right now, while China's own economy is under stress from energy price inflation, while global fuel markets are in chaos, while a US-China summit is being scheduled, is not in its interest. Chinese diplomats have repeatedly called for peace in the region over the past weeks, and while they've neither confirmed nor denied having a hand in brokering a ceasefire agreed last week, the White House said that high-level talks took place between the US and China as negotiations around the deal played out. Beijing is working the back channels. It is not absent from this crisis, it is deeply embedded in it, but on its own terms, at its own pace, through its own methods. Trump alleged in a social media post that Chinese President Xi Jinping is very happy that the Strait of Hormuz is open and/or rapidly opening, and noted that his upcoming trip to China, scheduled for next month, will be a special one and potentially historic. That last phrase is doing a lot of work. Trump is signaling that he wants a deal with Beijing, a grand bargain of some kind that encompasses not just the immediate Hormuz crisis, but the broader framework of US-China competition. He is dangling the summit as a carrot, warning about intercepted ships as a stick, and watching to see how Xi moves. Xi, for his part, is moving very carefully, very slowly, and saying as little as possible in public. Chinese President Xi Jinping has called for an immediate and comprehensive ceasefire to ensure normal passage via the Strait of Hormuz. An immediate and comprehensive ceasefire. That formulation is instructive. Immediate because every day the strait is closed costs China economically. Comprehensive because Beijing does not want a partial reopening that preserves US leverage. It wants a clean return to the pre-war status quo, where Iranian oil flows freely to Chinese ports through an open waterway that no single power controls. That is Beijing's ideal outcome. Whether it gets that outcome depends on whether Trump and Netanyahu decide they have extracted enough concessions from Tehran, or whether they decide the strategic opportunity to permanently reshape Gulf energy architecture is too good to pass up. Here is what you need to understand about the deeper historical gravity of this moment. The US-Saudi oil for security deal, that quiet understanding forged between FDR and King Ibn Saud in 1945, has been the bedrock of American global power for 80 years. The Hormuz blockage is the biggest market disruption in the history of the oil industry and delivered a major blow to the long-standing US-Saudi oil for security bargain that has endured in various forms since 1945. That deal meant that Gulf oil would be priced in US dollars, that the US military would guarantee the security of Gulf monarchies, and in return, America would have a structural advantage over every rival power that needed oil to run its economy. It was an elegant system. It made the dollar indispensable. It gave Washington leverage over Tokyo, over Seoul, over Berlin, over Beijing. You want to run your economy? You need oil. You need oil. You need dollars. You need dollars. You need Washington's goodwill. That chain of dependency, quietly, efficiently enforced, has been the real engine of American hegemony for the last half-century. And now Iran, in one audacious and economically painful move, has revealed the vulnerability at the heart of that system. The oil is there. The fields are full, but it cannot get out without Iran's permission. Every barrel from Kuwait, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE, stranded. Every LNG cargo from Qatar, stranded. Every dollar of revenue that the Gulf monarchies needed to stay solvent, to buy their military equipment, to pay their population's generous subsidies, gone, for as long as Tehran decides it should be gone. The question that matters most now is not whether there will be a ceasefire. There will be sooner or later, because the economic pain is too great for too many parties to sustain indefinitely. The question is, what kind of world emerges on the other side of this ceasefire? Does Gulf oil return to flowing through the strait in the same patterns as before, with China remaining the dominant buyer of Iranian barrels and the US unable or unwilling to truly enforce its own sanctions? Or does Washington use this crisis as the opening to permanently restructure those energy flows, building the pipelines, securing the Abraham Accords expansion, locking in new infrastructure that routes Gulf oil away from Asian markets and toward the American alliance network? And through all of this, Xi Jinping watches, he calculates. He prepares for the summit with Trump, knowing that whatever is agreed in that room will shape the energy economics of his country for the next generation. He cannot be seen as weak. He cannot be seen as a passive spectator to decisions that will determine whether China's industrial economy runs cheaply or runs at a crippling premium. But he also cannot afford open confrontation with Washington right now, not while his economy is absorbing the shocks of this crisis, not while his Belt and Road partners in Asia and Africa are panicking about their own energy costs, not while the global trading system that China depends on for its export machine remains so fragile. The silence from Beijing is not weakness, it is patience. And in geopolitics, patience is often the most dangerous thing of all. Because a country that is patient, that absorbs a blow, recalculates, reorganizes, and waits for the right moment, is a country that is playing a much longer game than the one being announced in Truth Social posts and press conferences. What you are watching right now from the Gulf oil fields that Iran has effectively placed under its strategic veto, to Trump naming China on social media while Xi says nothing, is the opening move of a confrontation that is going to define the next several decades of global order. The energy architecture of the modern world is being redesigned in real time. The question for America, and for you, watching this from the United States, is whether your government is actually building a better, more resilient system, or whether it is simply breaking the old one without a clear plan for what comes next.